Hi, everybody, and welcome to this event, Weaponizing Faith, the Role of Religious Nationalism and Disinformation in Destroying Democracy with author Katherine Stewart. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Jews for a Secular Democracy is our pluralistic social justice initiative. I want to thank the Rabbi Joseph H. Gumner Community Action Project, a program of Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center, for hosting this with us. I'm going to pass it to Lynn Davis in a moment to introduce herself, but I wanted to just provide a little bit of context and welcome our guest speaker. I don't know if there's anyone here who is not aware of Christian nationalism and the impact that it has had so far and continues to have on the US government, but it is the reason why we created Jews for a Secular Democracy, to help guard our First Amendment freedoms, which are greatly under attack and affect issues like LGBTQ equality, abortion access, and many other things that we will be getting into today. And I don't want to take up too much time on the background, but if you haven't heard of it somehow, you're going to hear a lot about it tonight and hopefully walk away a lot more informed, thanks in large part to our guest, Katherine Stewart, who I'm going to introduce, but then I'm going to pass it to Lynn. But we will hear lots from Katherine, who is the author, an award-winning author of the newest book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Her previous book, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, formed the basis of the documentary feature, God and Country, produced by Rob Reiner. Stewart's work appears in the New York Times, New Republic, Religious News Service, and elsewhere. But first, I'm going to ask Lynn to introduce herself, and then we'll get into the interview. Lynn?
Paul, thank you very much. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me to be part of this evening. My name is Lynn Davis. I am director of the Rabbi Joseph H. Gumner Community Action Project at Tucson Jewish Museum and Holocaust Center. We're thrilled to be able to co-sponsor this evening, and we have some other co-sponsors that I would like to acknowledge. Those are Temple Israel in Orlando, the Society for Humanistic Judaism, Or Hadam Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in Phoenix, the Secular Humanist Jewish Circle of Tucson, Congregation Beth Adam, NCJW, National Council of Jewish Women Miami, Jewish Community Relations Council of Broward County, LCL Hastings Broward, Black Jewish Alliance, Women Confronting Racism in Detroit, Folkschule in Philadelphia, the Shalom Center, the Workers Circle, Jewish Community Action Minnesota, Arizona Faith Network, and NCJW Arizona section. Paul touched on a couple of reasons that this webinar is important. And I think first and foremost, it's in the title, right? We're talking about the movement to destroy democracy. And that feels especially important, not especially important, but equally important to the Jewish community, because I think we can all agree that where democracy wanes, extremism rises. And I credit to Amy Spitalnik of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs for those wise words. But extremism and anti-Semitism are old friends around the globe, and unfortunately in this country too. Katherine mentions in the beginning of the book, and again, you didn't come to hear from me, but that there's no room in Christian nationalism for the separation of church and state, as encoded in the Constitution, and no recognition of the pluralism that characterized the American experience from the start, or the American experiment, excuse me, from the start. And I come from a Jewish community relations field, and we say very often that Jews and other marginalized communities, and that and is very critically important, can only thrive in a healthy civil society and a robust democracy. And so that, essentially and existentially is what we're here to talk about tonight. In her book, Katherine introduces us to the funders, the think tanks, the activists and deniers, the conservative voters, the Trump supporters, the power players, leaders, and politicians who are all activating and amplifying this movement. And it's It's an amazing read. It's kind of a terrifying read, but luckily at the very end, she talks about the way forward. So hopefully we'll get to that part as well this evening. So without further ado, we're going to spend about an hour here together. We will save 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A. And as Katie mentioned, please put your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar as opposed to the chat. So Katherine, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I'm just going to start with something very basic. In your latest book, Money, Lies, and God, you delve deeply into how religious nationalism and specifically Christian nationalism is reshaping US politics. Can you explain the key forces behind this movement and how the weaponization of faith and the use of disinformation are key tools in pushing this agenda?
Yes, thank you so much, Lynn. I'd like to answer that question, but first I'd like to thank you and Paul and Katie and everyone else involved in organizing this event. And I'd like to thank all of you joining in today for this conversation. And it was so encouraging to hear the long list of groups with whom you collaborate, because that sort of collaborative effort is key to sort of pushing back on, building resistance to what we're seeing today. And we'll get to that later in the conversation. But first, I want to talk about the key forces involved in the anti-democratic movement. I speak about a number of them at work in different sections of the book, but I really have narrowed it down to, three in the title: Money, Lies, and God. So the money group is a relatively small group of people with an awful lot of money who have invested heavily in building up this movement. They're driven to push unpopular policies designed mainly to protect their wealth or justify the vast accumulation of wealth over time. Sometimes they're also committed religious nationalists and are driven by sort of religious and cultural goals, but sometimes, frankly, they're not. When we're thinking about the funders of the movement, we're thinking about people. I'll just throw out a few names here, like the Corkerys or Barry Side or the Wilkes brothers or Tim Dunn or the members of the Prince DeVos family juggernaut, and so many others that I really hone in on in Money, Lies, and God. So religiously, here's the point. They're all over the place, Some of them are driven more by religious goals, and others have seem to not be driven much at all by religious goals, but they're sort of united in their determination to destroy liberalism, frankly, and smash what they sometimes call the administrative state. So they are a major factor in the growth of the anti-democratic movement. The lies in the title refers to misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracism. So there are several parts to that. The part that everyone is really familiar with is the far-right media sphere, where you have these massive propaganda networks masquerading as news, taking advantage of the fact that people today don't always get news from reliable sources, but are sort of easily manipulated. So you have that force driving people to sort of far-right politics and anti-democratic politics. Then there's the part of the misinformation that's led by intellectuals of the movement, a group I call the thinkers. They are largely affiliated with the movement called the New Right. And these people are playing an interesting game where they're essentially a bridge between the money people who pay their salaries and a kind of militant minority of the rank and file, and that come with extreme ideologies that justify a takedown of the system. And then finally, we have what I call the God side. Most of the focus on Christian nationalism is on the base of the Christian nationalist voters, or voters who believe, when they answer surveys, they think, yes, America is a Christian nation, should be, our laws should be based on the Bible. And that is important because we have large numbers of Americans who are open to these ideas, and including the idea that all the features of government and society should be dominated by Christians of a certain type. Those attitudes, by the way, are often formed and sort of shaped by leaders of the movement. But I also really make a lot of effort to draw attention to the role of the leaders, right? Because this is a leadership-driven movement. It's leadership-driven and organization-driven. So you have these sort of power brokers or power players within the movement. It includes a number of, I would say, very political pastors, national activists, leaders of key organizations, and others who have made a career out of promoting Christian nationalism and its movement. And they've gained a tremendous amount of power and influence, especially in manipulating the base of sort of rank and file voters.
So much to unpack, but let's kind of start with the basis upon which we would like to think we have some rights, which is the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which supposedly guarantees religious freedom by preventing the government from establishing a religion and ensures the free exercise of faith and conscience, right? It's got the two clauses that are often at odds with each other. So how does religious nationalism in government challenge this fundamental principle? And why do you think it is so important to protect this separation? And moreover, what do we do as a country? What do we stand to lose if this movement continues unabated as it appears to be? It certainly appears to be at the height of its power.
That's a great question, Paul. Well, I think the first thing to note regarding religious freedom and separation of church and state is just because something is in the Constitution doesn't mean that it's being carried out in real life. The separation of church and state has been under intense attack for decades, and the wall of separation that has protected our religious freedom is crumbling. The most serious changes have been made possible by a frankly radical Supreme Court that has misinterpreted or reinterpreted key principles of the First Amendment and also the religion clauses of the First Amendment, including the Establishment Clause. So that Supreme Court has frankly been stacked with individuals who really don't, they're really seeking to reinterpret the First Amendment and its various components. They've reframed religious freedom as the right of people with certain conservative religious beliefs to be exempt from the laws that apply to everyone else. And they've used that principle as an attack on civil rights. They're opening the spigots of public funding for sort of conservative religious organizations, churches, and religious groups. So why does this matter? I mean, I think there are many, many reasons to endorse the American founders' vision of, I would name three of these reasons as really paramount. The vision of separation of church and state and true religious freedom, which is, the first is very simply that these individual rights that we have, the right to worship freely, but not to be compelled to worship if we don't want to, not to be the founders actually thought it would be tyranny to compel an individual to have to fund a religion that they don't, happen to be a part of with their tax dollars. They specifically called it tyranny. So we really have these rights. Religious freedom is a really good and valuable thing to have. It's frankly wonderful to live in a society where you can worship any way you want to, or in no way if you don't want to, and that doesn't have any bearing on your rights and abilities to participate as a citizen in our democracy. This is a principle that they put into our Constitution. It's an intrinsically valuable principle, and our founders understood that. A second point is that the separation of church and state allows us to pursue policies in a way that answers to the needs of all people and that looks for the best solutions on the basis of evidence and reason, right? So you can believe in whatever you want to, any God or sacred idea or none, but public policies and solutions are going to be deliberated in public, transparent to all, and on the basis of evidence and reason. And so to have that kind of free and open discussion in a pluralistic society, you really need to sort of stop people from trying to impose their religious visions on policies that affect everybody, and instead have policies based on sort of evidence and the facts and a sense of the common good. A third element is corruption. I mean, this is really germane to this particular political moment. When you start bringing church and state together, you invite terrific amounts of corruption. because you're taking money from all of the taxpayers and you're funneling it to institutions that are not answerable to the public. And frankly, nor should they be. They shouldn't be expected to be. And it's precisely for that reason that they're not transparent. Religious organizations don't have to adhere to the same non-discrimination laws or other types of laws that other non-religious nonprofits and for-profits have to adhere to. They don't have to open their books to the IRS in the same way that non-religious nonprofits and for-profits have to, and they don't, they get all these sort of special financial benefits, parsonage exemptions, and the like. But when you start doling taxpayer money, that's yours and mine, out to such groups, and trying to effectively establish religion in that way, you create a kind of endless opportunity for corruption. Because once the money goes into a religious organization, it's not really traceable anymore. So there are many arguments one can and should make for the defense of separation of church and state. But the fact is, our founders were fundamentally right about this. And unfortunately, the separation is under attack. It's under attack by people who have abused language and legal arguments and distorted the very idea of religious freedom in order to sort of open a back door to imposing their preferred varieties of religion on everyone else.
Katherine, thank you. And I think that your point about corruption is the perfect segue into this next question. I mean, when we hear corruption, we often think about money. And in your book, you talk at length about how the movement has found, such a strong financial backing. Talk a little bit more about the role of billionaire funders fueling religious nationalism and why. It seems almost a strange mix sometimes because many of them are not religious in the way that we might think. And, who are we talking about and what is their involvement? Why is their involvement so concerning when we talk about the future of democracy?
Yeah, a lot of people are scratching their heads, like, why are these sort of tech bros, getting sort of, behind this program? I think it's really important to understand the role of the super wealthy funders because they are increasingly driving the process. And as you said, Lynn, their motivations are not always religious in general, even though some of them are. So in this group, you have a fair number of people, very wealthy people, committed to essentially libertarian economic ideologies. They say that they want, the free markets to be able to do their thing. They think capitalism is fabulous and they just want to be able to, let the markets do their thing and produce prosperity for everybody. But at the same time, as they're talking about free markets, they're also, in many instances, after protective policies for their monopolistic businesses. And they're after, in many instances, huge, tax subsidies, taxpayer subsidies for their businesses. I'm looking at you, Elon Musk. So, functionally, people like Musk and others like Jeff Yass and perhaps Barry Seid, they may not be motivated by religious concerns, but they see an alliance with sort of Christian nationalist leaders as just the kind of cost of doing business. They understand that religious nationalism is kind of a form of identity politics. It's about who's an insider and who's an outsider, who's sort of pure and who's impure, who's a true American and who isn't. So, it's a way of manipulating the voters, right, to get them to vote on certain issues. Movement leaders know if you can get people to vote on 2 or 3 issues, you can control their vote. So how are these billionaires who, are not motivated by religious concerns going to get those economic policies and protective policies for their monopolistic businesses and deregulatory policies they want? How are they going to bring that about? Well, you sort of form an alliance with, religious right leaders who message to the rank and file and get them to vote a certain way. A lot of these billionaires, by the way, are big believers in big oil, maximizing fossil fuel consumption, and they want sort of a reduction of, any kind of environmental protections, so they can continue to increase their fortunes. I would say there's another factor that's a bit more psychological. And I think that a lot of these extremely wealthy people, they're not just like normal wealthy people. I mean, the way that they live is really kind of extraordinary. They live on islands in a way, um, that are, where they're surrounded by people because they're so wealthy who are doing things for them and telling them how wonderful they are all the time. But from sort of over the walls or across the water, so to metaphorically speaking, they can hear the cries of people saying, well, you know that like there's growing economic inequality in our country that's making life so much harder for people who are, ordinary people, members of the workforce, people who have to earn a salary because, life is degrading for those folks. It's harder to, a lot of us see that life is a lot economically more challenging than it was for our parents. So they have these, they're looking at the people with fabulous wealth and thinking, well, that's not quite right. Maybe you should be paying the same taxes as a school teacher, or maybe you should be paying, treating your workers a little better so that they don't have to, in many instances, go on, government programs in order to afford healthcare and food and the like. And so, the sort of very wealthy people start to feel quite defensive about that. A lot of them have this idea that they've earned every penny they have with their bare hands. And so they're kind of joining together with a movement that is going to actually justify as well as increase their wealth. So this kind of wealth, often will seek to preserve itself one way or another. And in the case of these funders of the movement, they are doing so by subverting democracy.
Well, as we know, and I think a lot of folks are joining us tonight because the Jewish community has a long history of advocating for the protection of religious freedom, because it's our own protection that we're advocating for, both as a religious minority in America. And one of the reasons that we started Jews for Secular Democracy as humanistic Jews is that so many Jews in America are also secular. And secular people are not well represented, for example, among our elected officials, openly secular folks. So both as Jews and secular people, we're very invested in religious freedom, or the freedom to not be religious. So how is the rise of religious nationalism especially concerning for Jews? And what risk does it pose to our community's ability to freely practice our beliefs?
Well, right now, the Trump administration is unfortunately using anti-Semitism as a wedge for authoritarianism. It's going after universities and other groups on the basis that they have been anti-Semitic. And while there may have been some instances of anti-Semitism, this is not actually what the Trump administration is trying to address. They're using claims about anti-Semitism as a way of pushing their policy preferences, essentially saying that they're going to use the power of government to suppress the views of those with whom they disagree. And they're also using it as a means of intimidation. I mean, I just read this morning about a young woman who came to this country, I think from Korea, at the age of 7, who attended some kind of a protest and wasn't even an organizer. And they've been trying to sort of um, detain her. And I haven't really followed up. I'm not sure where she is now. I think she sort of disappeared. But it's this kind of thing is being done very publicly in order to intimidate people and show the power of the state. I mean, it's kind of frankly rich for a movement that has been lecturing people on the moderate liberal left for years about free speech and cancel culture. And all of a sudden they're trying to use the power of government to actually punish in this very public way people whose speech they disagree with. But here's something that I find really concerning. It's going to have the effect of boxing American Jews into a corner because, I think it's going to alienate a lot of American Jews from sectors of the American left, because a lot of those sectors may assume that American Jews are on board with all of this, not just the critique of anti-Semitism, but the authoritarianism, sort of cancel culture, it's, if we want to call it that, sort of suppression of forms of speech that the government disagree with. So while it's great to be anti-Semitic, we shouldn't kid ourselves that the focus on anti-Semitism from the authoritarian movement is going to really help us deal with the real problem of anti-Semitism among sectors of the American left as well as the American right, because this also increases anti-Semitism on the right. They will think, as I think people like Steve Bannon and Trump himself has said, if you're not on our side on these issues, you're anti-Semitic or not properly Jewish. I think that the term Trump used for Chuck Schumer was, we're revoking your Jew card. He said something along those lines. I mean, it's really offensive. So
He
it's
called him a Palestinian. He said he's not Jewish, he's a Palestinian.
right. So it's fetishizing. It turns Jews into a scapegoat for authoritarian actions under the pretense of defending Jews. It's really isolating American Jews and making American Jews into a special category.
Katherine, thank you for that. So given all the power and financial backing behind these movements, do you see any hope or successful strategies that have been used to resist religious nationalism in, in other parts of the world, in the US itself? What would you advise everyday citizens to do to help protect democracy?
Oh, there's so much to say here. I could do a seminar just on this. Politico published a really terrific piece by the Turkish journalist Ashley Adin Tabyas. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She lived through Erdogan's methodical process of state capture and his, she offers a half dozen pieces of advice for not only surviving the coming 4 years, but also coming out stronger. A few key takeaways. First, don't panic because she said autocracy takes time. Now, I think we are seeing a kind of shocking pace of action in our government, but I do like this sort of idea to not panic and really just think more strategically about response, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It is really important to stay engaged and not just like sort of hide under the covers. We have to skip the purity politics in favor of strategic and broad-based actions. She wrote, if America will survive the next 4 years if Democrats pick themselves up and start learning from the successes of opponents of autocracy around the globe. So there is a lot to learn from looking overseas and seeing what has worked as well as what hasn't. So, what tends to work is, first of all, something everybody can do. Local activism. If we don't get involved in our town governance and town meetings and school boards and we think someone else is going to handle it, guess who's coming along to take that space is groups like Moms for Liberty. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with them. They're the ones who are accusing public schools of, stacking their libraries with pornography and teaching CRT, which they're not doing, and the like. So local activism really does matter. It's important to know what's happening with your community. I think it's really important to support pro-democracy organizations. There are so many of them out there. And also it's really important for organizations to work in tandem with one another, which is one of the reasons I was so encouraged by the list of organizations to which you gave sort of shout outs. There is no substitute for turning out the vote. No substitute. A lot of the way I do my research, I go to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings. And I heard this one leader, Ralph Reed, some of you may know who he is. He's a big picture sort of strategist. He's been in the game for a long time on the religious right. And he said, pay no attention to polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's right. And we have to note that when they lost in 2020, by the way, the country didn't go MAGA. If you look at the percentages by which presidents win elections, Trump won by a relatively small margin. He won by a smaller margin than Joe Biden won in 2020. So when they lost in when they lost in 2020, they didn't, get into bed and and sort of just tune out and watch Netflix. They did things we would not want to do. Those who support democracy would not want to inspire political violence. Those who support democracy would not want to spread disinformation and sort of otherize, demonize their political opposition. But what they also did, which is what would want to do, is turn out the base and go after low propensity voters. And that's really critical. And finally, I would, emphasize, sort of underscore something that the journalist Ashley said, which is we need a big tent. We are not going to agree on everything. Those of us who believe in the principles of democracy and pluralism and equality, we're not going to agree on everything. We're not going to get everything we want. And frankly, we probably shouldn't, because it's a really big pluralistic democracy with a lot of different groups of people, different interests. But if we can agree on some core principles, if we can agree on more than we disagree on, then we can work together. I think at a lot of the religious right conferences I go to, I've started hearing speakers talk about, they'd paraphrase Ronald Reagan and they'd say, Ronald Reagan said, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. And, this is good advice. So we can work together and sort of step up our game. I think, our democracy still stands a chance.
There are a lot of questions and comments, which is wonderful, and folks are really engaged by everything you had to say. I'm going to jump in on one and maybe kind of combine it a little bit with my own thoughts. And you kind of just alluded to going to these programs. And if folks haven't yet read your work, I am amazed at where you've been. And I think I would be terrified at where you put yourself. And so, but you have an insight that I think almost none of us on this webinar have as to what is their thinking. And so I really appreciate that you've established that the power is about economics, because I really think it's about economics and who is controlling so much of what's happening. But as far as the following, the folks, what is their theology? The question Bruce asked is like, what is one tenet that Christian nationalism wants to promote? And someone else later asked about like the hypermasculinity within Christian nationalism. So what is some of like the theology that you hear at these gatherings?
I think when we're looking at the movement, broadly speaking, a lot of people characterize it as a white evangelical movement, and that's not quite right. I mean, there are a lot of white evangelicals who support the movement, but there are a lot who don't. Evangelicalism is very diverse in America. And also, it's important to note that the movement would be nowhere without a cadre of ultra-conservative Catholics, charismatics, and the independent charismatic movement and Pentecostals are also bringing new energy to the movement. And one of the interesting features about that is that kind of language and style of these independent charismatic movements is sort of, including the NAR, is sort of spilling over into sectors of the movement that are not themselves charismatic or Pentecostal. So there's this sort of idea, they sort of promote this idea that spiritual warfare in the heavens is sort of playing out every day here on earth. And, God's hand is on Donald Trump's shoulder, and they really demonize the political opposition. I mean, they literally demonize. I've heard democratic organizations being referred to as demonic organizations. They also have this idea that, anything that is any sector of government or society that is not dominated by people like them is, under the control of Satan. So you're hearing even people who are not particularly religious talk about, demonize the political opposition. And even this idea of this sort of woke mind virus that you hear some of the tech bros talking about is a sort of idea that's very prominent on the new right. It's almost like saying there's this sort of demonic force that's taking over anyone who is against them and has to be defeated by any means necessary. I would say rather than any distinctive theologies, I've seen a certain mindset that's pretty common to the movement, and it includes I would say 4 different features. The first feature is, frankly, identity politics, right? They accuse the left of playing identity politics. I think they play it harder. You're with us or you're against us. You're one of us or you're one of them. You're one of the pure versus one of the impure, right? And that's where some of the demonization comes in. Second is a persecution narrative. It's the idea that conservative Christians and MAGA movement members are the most persecuted group in society. And then the third element is a kind of apocalypticism, the idea that thanks to this persecution, we're facing an absolute apocalyptic threat. The consequences of loss in the political arena are too dire to ignore, and therefore, sort of, we're on this edge of an abyss. It's a crisis, a constant crisis, and this is an idea promoted by both the religious right and the new right, which is another sort of sector of the movement that I focus on in my book. But that apocalypticism really clears the way for the acceptance of an authoritarian ruler, a strong man, someone who's going to break the laws, who doesn't respect the rule of law, who's going to move the goalposts over and over until they're no longer even in the playing field, and basically scrap the rule of law in favor of the iron fist. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, play out in our politics today. There have been a number of thinkers who have come up with a sort of intellectual justification for the idea of, the power of a unitary executive, the idea that there's really no laws at all that constrain the leader and his inner circle. And this is a very anti-democratic movement. Look, I think it's really important not to cede ground in terms of American values, the values of individual freedoms, the pursuit of knowledge and education, the values of rational thought, a commitment to equality under the law. These are values that are frankly deeply consistent with Judaic values, and also at the same time, they're thoroughly American values. So let's not allow authoritarians to claim that they're the only ones with values on their side.
If I may, I'm also going to take the liberty of, combining a few questions or a few issues that have arisen in the Q&A. And, you mentioned identity politics, but we haven't really talked about race, issues of race, issues of gender, the way that this sort of uber male, or, I'm going to go ahead and say toxic masculinity, is glorified in a lot of these spaces and throughout the movement. So can you touch on those two dynamics a little bit? You do mention, you mentioned misogyny in your book at length, again, in a rather chilling way, but yeah, if you'd like to address that a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I address also the issue of race, specifically in my previous book, The Power Worshippers, where I talk about kind of roots, a sort of intellectual genealogy of much of some of the movement leaders, a sector of movement leaders. I think there's so much to talk about. Again, like briefly, I think that we can combat some of these influences by insisting on the values of pluralism and equality. We need to ask people who might be on the fence if they want a society built on openness and tolerance, or do they want one built on hate and exclusion? I think it's really important to help people in the mainstream see these as genuinely human rights. These stories need to be told about individuals and the price that they are paying for the kinds of exclusion we're seeing now with this sort of, I'd call it a kind of, anti-DEI stuff. It's just, promoting this idea that if you are not a conservative white male, your achievements, your place in society can be questioned. What do we, it's amazing. This, we were just looking in the news today about this sort of Signal chat, which Pete Hegseth was leading, and it's not secure. And there was a journalist from The Atlantic on it. You just look at Hegseth himself. His whole thing is anti-DEI, and the guy can't even keep secure communications. But it's beyond incompetence. It also shows a massive disrespect for laws, and for the idea, the principles that have been put into place over time legally that say you have to keep your communications really secure, not just put them on some kind of commercial network and that could be accessed by others. And you need to preserve those kinds of decisions for the record. And he's just kind of saying, well, I don't need to respect the laws. If anybody anywhere lower down in the military had done this kind of thing, they'd be out of a job immediately. They'd be out of a position. But he's actually digging in and defending it. So it's like, I think of him as frankly the ultimate, you know, DEI hire for a conservative, a certain type of conservative person.
And actually, when you were talking about the live
I would say not
section,
DEI, I would say I would say affirmative action for a certain kind of conservative person.
yeah, totally. And when you were talking about the live section of your book, I was thinking about what we're seeing right now in their response, which is not, yes, we screwed up. It's there was nothing wrong. It's just like deny, 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 and create an alternative reality. And because they've got this media ecosystem that will confirm their lies, it's like there really is this alternate reality, and it's bizarre to be in what I think is the real world and know that so many Americans believe something else completely. It's truly disturbing and bizarre uh, time that we're living in. One thing that you also just said was about people on the fence. So I wanted to talk a bit about those folks because the demographic studies that I've seen that try to get at Christian nationalism talk about kind of like, they don't use this language, but like the hardcore folks are maybe 10%, and we're never going to convince them. But then there's this kind of medium of folks who may answer yes, our laws should be based on Christianity, but that they may be swayable. And in fact, that is part of the idea behind Jews for Secular Democracy, is that if we could explain how the Jewish perspective on so many of these issues is different, or that there is really no such thing as Judeo-Christian, right? Which is a phrase that every time I hear it, it's always now coming from the right, and it's almost always being used as some cover for either anti-LGBTQ policies or something, like trying to co-opt the Jewish tradition to give them cover that they're being inclusive about it. So that's one of the other things that we want to push back on. And what we're looking for is, are there effective ways to sway the folks who might be on the fence? Is talking about like the difference of experience that like Jews in America have had. Is that in any way helpful or effective in trying to sway that perhaps potentially swayable middle ground?
I mean, when we're talking about potentially swayable people, you're talking about just like huge numbers of people with different sort of interests and agendas and ideas and identities. So I don't think there's ever going to be a one size fits all. But I do think it's really important to communicate to people what's at stake, and to help them understand that, sometimes their vote really does matter. And it's really important not just to vote in election cycles, national cycles, but also in local elections, and to vote up and down the ballot. Those conversations really are worth having. I think it's really great to try and help people see beyond the culture war issues that are used like shiny baubles or like laser pointer cat toys. You guys know that cat toy that like shines a red light on the ground and a cat jumps around and just sees that and doesn't realize it's being played with? Well, sometimes I see some of those big culture war issues that the right is constantly amplifying as like that. It's a shiny laser, it's a laser pointer cat toy. So they will, focus on this issue over here. Meanwhile, they're not looking at the source of their, say, economic challenges. I mean, this is a movement that frankly claims to stand for the American family, and yet it's driving support for politicians whose economic policies are actually making it so much harder for so many American families to succeed. So it's really helpful to try to get people to look beyond those shiny baubles of the culture wars and see the bigger picture.
We have a couple questions in the chat about Project Esther. which I will admit I'm not familiar with. And people are asking about a link between Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism, and similarities between Project Esther and Project 2025, how both seek to shut down free speech and activism around things that don't align with their goals. Do you have any observations about that?
I wish I could speak about Project Esther, but I'm not terribly familiar with
Okay.
it. I know more about Project 2025, which for anybody listening is like a 900-page document that was put together in advance of the 2024 election to prepare for what they call the next conservative president. And we're really seeing that play out in big ways in the current administration. It's a kind of, you see within it a marriage of new right goals and also religious right goals. But I'm sorry, I can't really speak to Project Esther.
I'll chime in on it for 2 minutes. The good news is it's only like 5 pages compared to the 900, but it's written by the same people who wrote Project 2025. And maybe the question for you, Katherine, is how is Project 2025 actually coming true now? Like, as far as it really does feel like it's a blueprint, but in a lot of ways, and you just Google Project Esther and you will find the actual document. This is not secret. Like, they put it out there, the same folks, the Heritage Foundation. And what it does is, and you talked about this at the top, it weaponizes anti-Semitism to go after left-leaning activists, including Jews. And they name it. And I know that there were no Jews harmed, there were no Jews used in the making of that document because they reference Reformed Jews. So anyone who knows the Jewish community well knows that it's Reform Judaism, not Reformed. There's no ED at the end of Reformed Judaism. But in that document, and I read that, and I'm like, did they not find a single Jewish person to read it, to at least proof it? It is remarkable. It is a group of Christian nationalists who see an advantage of weaponizing anti-Semitism, which I'm not downplaying anti-Semitism, it's real. But what they do is say that there is a Hamas support network in America. It includes groups like Jewish Voices for Peace, who are Jews, right? You may disagree with their political positions, but these are Jews and they're named. Soros, of course, is named, and it is a remarkable read and a short read, but like with Project 2025, which I'll hand over to you, it's coming true. You can see the blueprint. And as you mentioned, it wasn't just that one Columbia leader who, unfortunately, I saw a lot of support for the removal of him from society by the Jewish community, right? He was disappeared by ICE. He wasn't arrested by the police, right? But now there's this young woman who is of, I believe, Korean descent. She came here when she was 7. She was valedictorian of her high school. She participated in protests, but she didn't lead them. And now she's in hiding and trying to hope that the law will protect her from being deported to a country that she doesn't remember living in. So Project Esther is worth your read and worth your fear because it's working as a blueprint in the same way that Project 2025 is. So what have you seen like kind of come true with Project 2025, and what have you seen maybe them not have as much success implementing?
Well, thanks for the question about Project 2025. I think the prime example we can look at is Doge, right? It's abundantly clear that they're really taking the sledgehammer approach, smashing the administrative state, which they promised to do. And they're doing it in ways that are frankly going to prove very costly. For example, they're sabotaging the IRS's ability to collect taxes, which is likely to diminish receipts and increase cheating. They're canceling contracts midstream, which essentially wastes money. They're destroying a Consumer Protection Bureau, which has actually returned billions of dollars to Americans who had been fleeced. They're taking actions against employees that have already brought lawsuits and this will again cost money. So it's clear that the process is frankly driven by ideological motivations rather than any rational or practical planning. Elon Musk basically captured the thinking when he showed up with a chainsaw and said he was going to defeat the woke mind virus. So all of this was foretold in not just the Project 2025, but frankly, in a number of episodes in the first Trump administration, one episode that I draw attention to in Money, Lies, and God relates to the leadership governing Voice of America. Trump hired a sort of new right fellow to head the unit that handles Voice of America. And according to multiple news reports in the Washington Post, NPR, and elsewhere, he simply started destroying things, but until it was sort of too much for even Trump 1. But now Trump 2 has come back to sort of make good on this idea of destruction. I mean, we're also seeing the nihilism in the moral cowardice of leaders of the Republican Party. The Hegseth Signal Group that's in the news right now is really a good example of that. The members of the administration are flat out denying what we can all see with our own eyes, which is that they are engaged in an incredibly dangerous breach of security, and they did so without following lawfully prescribed processes. It's just a sort of behavior of people of contempt for democracy and think that there is nothing of value more than power itself. You know, when I put the thesis of my book out there before Trump won the election in 2024, I was kind of pretty sure I was going to get criticism for overstating the case. And now I feel like, if anything, I understated it.
Also chilling. But thank you. We're running down, and I'm going to give you a choice of 2 questions because there are so many good ones in the Q&A. One is about if there are liberal billionaires, where are they, and what are they doing, in a pro-democracy space? And the other question I've already forgotten. So let's do that.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Was what, if we look to the courts, if we look, like, what is the, I think someone was sort of asking you to look into a crystal ball, but do you think we can put faith and hope in the courts in this moment?
Yeah, I wish I want to sort of briefly address the future. I don't offer future visions or predictions because I think one problem with these predictions is they're usually drawn from a kind of extrapolation of what we're seeing in the present moment. And, a lot can happen in 4 years. And I just, my crystal ball is in the other room. I just don't have it with me. But in terms of there is a lot of liberal money in our country. There are liberal billionaires. There are many very wealthy people who really do care about our democracy and its preservation. I think that people on the sort of moderate liberal left tend to spend, who have that kind of money to spend it differently. Often they'll invest in technocratic solutions, or they'll invest in organizations that are working in silo, or they'll invest it in politicians who they want to support. And the way the right spends its money is in organizations and infrastructure and individuals. So that, there's difference between funding a network and funding an individual politician or an organization working in silo. And we can see which way is more effective. I mean, the Christian nationalist movement and the anti-democratic movement generally is as strong and effective as it is because of 5+ decades in that dense organizational infrastructure. They've invested in right-wing policy groups, legal advocacy groups, networking organizations, a sort of, messaging space, very, just a lot of different kind of features of this organizational infrastructure. And there really isn't, there is some networking happening sort of on the, among the pro-democracy movement, but there's more that needs to happen. And frankly, a lot more funding needs to flow into that kind of, organizational infrastructure. The other thing is, years ago, I read a book by, I wish I could see a show of hands, David Barton. He's a kind of key myth maker of the movement. He's, many of his works have been totally discredited, including one of his books, which was withdrawn by his Christian publisher, a conservative Christian publishing house, because it lacked for matters of fact. They said he was found to have made up some quotes or something from founders that didn't actually exist. But here's the thing. He said, arm yourself with the mentality of a distance runner. not a sprinter. And he's right. This movement has been patient. It's been long range in its thinking. It's been extremely strategic, especially on the legal front, very like carefully bringing the right cases to the right courts with just the right plaintiffs to create these novel legal building blocks that will give them a big win. And I think that kind of strategic thinking um, and a sort of commitment to organizational infrastructure is really important if we are to meet the challenge of the present moment.
That's great. And yeah, and I think there is a lot of work, a lot of organizing to do. I think that a lot of people, myself included, felt that rights continue to expand in US history. And like Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, like done deal, right? And that the goal, the ongoing goal was continue to expand rights, LGBTQ equality, and that we would get, we gay marriage is the law of the land, and we would keep going. And I don't think anyone was really fully aware of, except the folks on the right who were working toward it, of what the backlash would be. And I think we are not yet prepared. And I have so many other questions, but I do want to be mindful of time, and I want to give you the last word. Is there anything else that we should be taking away as we move forward, acknowledging that who knows what is even going to happen over the next couple of days, but what else can we do as activists, as voters in the coming weeks and year?
Well, thank you so much. First, I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. It's really been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And, just I suspect a lot of you who are listening in here are actually engaged in sort of pro-democracy activism in a lot of different ways. And then I heard somebody say once, like, if you don't know what to do, find someone who seems to be doing something that is useful, and then do that. It's like we're not all going to be able to do the same thing. We all have different interests and abilities, and abilities in terms of our time and our energy, et cetera. But it's really important to stay engaged and in building a pro-democracy movement. And I'm just very encouraged that everyone is here. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I feel really lucky that you are in this, that you're doing the work, that you're telling the truth to people who don't know it. And I've learned so much from what you've written, and I really appreciate everything you do. And I look forward to continuing to follow your work. And for folks who are joining us, and this is their first ever Jews for a Secular Democracy program, we will keep you posted on upcoming programs. I think a tenet of our work is exactly what you just said. We want to highlight the people who are doing things, who are bringing ideas to help get us back on track to a country where rights are expanding and not contracting for more people. So that's our goal, and we're so appreciative of everybody. Thank you, Lynn, for joining us tonight as well. It was great to meet you, and we'll go from here. Hopefully things will move forward better. So thank you again. Have a great night. Take care.